That life has changed over almost 4 billion years of Earth history is as firmly established as any idea in science. But how does life change? More than 150 years ago, the British naturalist Charles Darwin discovered that life on Earth continues to evolve by the process of natural selection. In the first half of this lecture, after reviewing the evidence for evolution, I'll examine the historical development of the theory of evolution by natural selection. I'll tell you about the biological mechanisms, as well as the philosophical implications of this sweeping theory. Then I'm going to focus about 2 topics of current research, fascinating areas that are unknown, unanswered questions regarding evolution. The first of these is the rate of evolution, as exemplified by the debate between the gradualists and those who favor punctuated equilibrium. The second question is the origin of mass extinctions, including a possible extinction event that's occurring right now caused by human beings. Let's review the evidence that life has changed over 4 billion years of Earth history. There are at least 5 sources of this evidence. The first, comparative anatomy, looking at the similar structures in very different organisms. Second, vestigial organs, the idea that some structures within our bodies and those of other organisms no longer have a function, and yet they point to earlier times where the animal evolved from those that did use those specific organs. Then we have the structures of cells and molecules that are similar in all living things. We have molecular phylogeny, the fact that genetic evidence shows the linkages between all living things. And finally, we have the incredible fossil record, the evidence that life has gradually changed over time, preserved in rocks that you and I can go out and collect and study systematically. All of this evidence points to the gradual change of life over time. But the fact of evolution doesn't reveal the mechanism of how life changes. Our understanding of that evolutionary process is largely the result of the work of one person, that's British naturalist Charles Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882. Charles Darwin was the son of famous parents. His father was the famed physician and philosopher Erasmus Darwin. His mother, Susanna, was the daughter of the celebrated potter Josiah Wedgwood. By all accounts, Charles was a mediocre student who greatly displeased his father. In fact, his father wrote him once, quote, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and to your family." After rather abortive studies in medicine and theology, he became interested in natural history, though he was by no means a skilled naturalist when he graduated from Cambridge in the year 1831. Nevertheless, Darwin was recommended to be the naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle on a 5-year exploring expedition to South America and the Pacific Islands. This was under the command of Captain Robert Fitzroy. Well, Charles Darwin took advantage of those years, from 1831 to 1836. He used them to read and to study about the natural sciences while he collected animal and plant and rock specimens and made innumerable observations in his notebooks. Throughout his travels, Darwin noted the large geological effect of gradual change. Remember James Hutton, who first proposed that idea of this uniformitarianism. He saw the formation of coral islands as one of these gradual processes. He saw that individual earthquakes could over time raise up land thousands of feet. He also noted variations among species from different regions, most notably differences among species of birds and tortoises from the Galapagos Islands. These are islands that are relatively closely situated to each other, but far enough apart that birds and tortoises and other animals can't easily transfer from one to the other. He wrote that such facts would undermine the stability of species. Indeed, as early as his voyages on the Beagle, Darwin was suspecting the possibility of evolution. At the time of Darwin's travels, it was widely accepted, primarily on religious grounds, that species can't be changed, that species were the result of a single creation event. Darwin's observations on his voyage caused him to question that idea, but he did it rather quietly and in a personal way. By 1837, less than a year after his return from that voyage, he had begun a personal, quote, notebook on the transmutation of the species. Transmutation meaning change or evolution. He tabulated all sorts of evidence for evolution. He noted, for example, the similarities in animal behavior. He noted, for example, the yawning of dogs, horses, and men as all similar physiological reactions. He cited a whole litany of evidence from fossils, from comparative anatomy, from vestigial organs, and from the geographical distribution of closely related but distinct species. Eventually, having convinced himself of the fact of evolution, Darwin set about trying to understand the mechanisms of evolution. Now, he was greatly influenced by the British economist Thomas Robert Malthus, who lived from 1766 to 1834. Malthus wrote the Essay on the Principles of Population. It was published in 1798, and this was extremely influential to Darwin. What Malthus said is that there's a relationship between food supply and human population. If you have unchecked population, Malthus argued, you'd lead to human misery. Darwin saw an exact parallel to animal and plant populations in the natural world. So by 1838, Darwin's theory of evolution had been framed. By 1842, he had written a brief outline of this new theory of evolution, which he called natural selection, and he had shared it with a few scientific colleagues. But in spite of the fact this was 1842, he hesitated to publish the work because he knew he'd meet great resistance to these ideas. Theories of evolution, after all, flew in the face of conventional religious doctrines. And frankly, Darwin was troubled by the seeming amorality of the natural world. If you look at nature, you do not see the beneficent hand of God in all that you survey. Well, it was years later, in fact in 1858, after considerable prodding from his friends, and also a letter from the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who had independently arrived at a similar theory, that Darwin finally wrote what he called an abstract of his thesis. That was the revolutionary book, The Origin of the Species, which was published in 1859, more than 20 years after he had his original idea. Darwin's Origin of Species is an amazing book. It's presented in lucid and very modest prose. It describes the process of evolution by natural selection. This theory, this powerful and persuasive theory, is based on 4 common sense observations and arguments. The first of these is that all species produce more offspring that can possibly survive to maturity because the resources of food and water and space are limited. The second idea is that individuals of a species display variations in their physical characteristics. These variations include the coloring, their speed, the eyesight, intelligence, all sorts of things. And individual traits, furthermore, usually resemble those of the parents. The third idea is that advantageous traits provide an individual with a better chance of surviving to produce more offspring, and therefore a better chance of passing on those traits from one generation to the next. And the fourth point, after many generations, gradual changes add up to large changes, that is, evolution. So this is a biological example of the kinds of geological thinking that had gone on before, small changes adding up to very large changes over long spans of time. Darwin labeled this process natural selection. He presented his case in a carefully reasoned series of steps, presenting evidence in a very low-key way, sort of like a legal brief, if you will. He began by drawing parallels with the process of artificial selection, or what we'd call selective breeding, so well known to British farmers and sportsmen. Humans, as you know, can produce a new breed of dog or a new breed of cattle in just a few dozen generations of very careful selective breeding, selecting for desirable traits. In Darwin's book, he talks at great length about domesticated pigeons, which are used for racing and for other sort of ornamental displays, and how you can evolve new varieties of pigeons very quickly in this way. He said that nature does the same thing, though in a less directed, a more random sort of process. During Darwin's time, there was a beautiful example of this process that went on right in Britain. And this is the story of the peppered moth. The peppered moth is a common moth in Britain. It occurs in 2 varieties, a more light variety and a darker variety. When Darwin first started thinking about this procedure, most of the tree trunks in England were rather light in color, and the light-colored moth, which got its camouflage from tree trunks, was more dominant. But during the course of the 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution, as soot kept belching out of smokestacks, the trunks of trees got darker and darker and darker. And gradually, the dark peppered moth became much more abundant because the light-colored moths were being eaten selectively. It turns out, in more recent years, as coal burning is no longer allowed, tree trunks have lightened up, and so have the moth populations. So this is a visible example over a couple hundred-year period of a change in a physical characteristic by natural selection. But some of the changes in organisms seem much more difficult. For example, how do you evolve an eye? I want to tell you about some amazing recent theoretical work by biologists Dan Nielsen and Susanne Pelger of Lund University in Sweden. Their work describes how an eye can evolve from a non-eye, if you will. Creationists still ask this question of what use is half an eye. What Nielsen and Pelger have done is modeled eye evolution, making a few very simple assumptions. Let me tell you about these assumptions first. One of the assumptions is that all eyes have to begin with one or more light-sensitive cells. And these cells have to be sandwiched in between a transparent layer, which sort of acts as a protective surface, and a substrate, sort of the base layer on which the light-sensitive cells rest. This assumption formalizes what biologists have known for a long time, that many primitive eyeless life forms, including one-celled organisms, including some bacteria, can actually sense the direction of light. Even though they're not eyes per se, you can sense where the light is coming through these light-sensitive cells. A second assumption is that there are natural variations of about 1% in the size and the shape, in the distribution of these cells. And this creates a random distribution of curvature, of things like thickness of the layer, the ability to bend light, and so forth. So if you think about the structure of an eye, these are key attributes. That is, the lens of the eye, the curvature of the eye, and so forth. These are characteristics that tell how the light is going to be absorbed into the eye and detected. You see similar 1% degrees of variation in all sorts of natural traits, so that's a very reasonable kind of assumption. From generation to generation, variations in traits that improve light gathering ability then are preserved. And this is another assumption of their computer model. While disadvantageous traits are not preserved. That is, if a curvature increases your light gathering ability, you keep that there. If a change in the distribution of cells to give you a better lens-like arrangement increases the ability to observe light, then once again you preserve that configuration. A random number generator tells you what sorts of random variations you're going to preserve from generation to generation, and what Nielsen and Pelger did was just let the computer program run, preserving advantageous variations, eliminating those that were not advantageous. And the results are absolutely remarkable. Invariably, within a few hundred generations, a well-defined eye cavity, which increases the amount of light-collecting surface and decreases the glare from surrounding areas, has formed, and this gives you initially flat surface, which becomes a curved surface. Shortly thereafter, you get a lens of thicker cells, and that lens gets thicker and becomes more and more adapted to focusing the light. These are small incremental improvements, but over time, they lead to a dramatic formation of an eye that looks very much like the modern human eye. Indeed, within about 2,000 cycles, about 2,000 generations, and that's a geological blink of an eye for most species, you get a fully developed eye which appears from that small patch of light-sensitive cells. The authors conclude, quote, "Even with a consistently pessimistic approach, the time required becomes amazingly short. From a few hundred years in flies to a few tens of thousand years in animals, eyes can develop." And these ideas are supported fully by the fossil record. If you look at the fossil record, you see that eyes have evolved independently, perhaps as many as 40 to 60 separate times in Earth history. So eyes are not just a miraculous event, they're almost an inevitable event in organisms that use light. Let's look at some of the controversies associated with Darwin's theories. Many theologians denounced the work almost immediately for its blatant contradiction of the scriptural view that all life was formed by a miraculous creation. In Darwin's scheme, even man was a product of random variations and natural selection, which just seemed impossible to them. There was a famous public debate about this issue. It was sponsored by the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1860, and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce mocked his Darwinian opponent, who was Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog who stood up for evolution. He asked Huxley whether it was on his grandfather's or his grandmother's side that the ape ancestry was to be found, and this caused a great chuckle amongst the audience. And this is how Huxley brushed that barb aside. He gave the following scathing retort. "A man has no reason to be ashamed of having an ape for his grandfather. If there were an ancestor whom I should feel shame in recalling, it would be rather a man of restless and versatile intellect, who, not content with an equivocal success in his own sphere of activity, plunges into scientific questions with which he has no real acquaintance, only to obscure them by aimless rhetoric and distract the attention of his hearers from the real point at issue by eloquent digression and skilled appeals to religious prejudice." I think Huxley won that barb. Many also found Darwin's ideas distasteful because the struggle for survival implied an amoral natural world. The ruthlessness of animals that cannibalized their mates, that butchered weak prey, that consumed their young even in some circumstances, was difficult to accept for people who saw God's beneficence in nature. Others embraced Darwin's ideas but took them to an extreme that the author never intended. Sociologist Herbert Spencer, for example, coined the phrase survival of the fittest, and he applied the idea of natural selection to rationalize the development of a social hierarchy. The so-called social Darwinists had nothing to do with Darwinian theory at all. They merely used natural selection as a way to rationalize their prejudices. Some supporters of Darwin erroneously interpreted the word evolution to mean progress, with humans as the logical culmination of a natural process. The icon of Darwinism of the chimpanzee and then ever less stooped organisms till you have the upright human as being a logical progression is not at all what Darwin had in mind. He saw evolution as something that had nothing to do with progress. Indeed, he never used the word evolution in his original book. He saw the natural process as being amoral. It was unguided. There was no sign of God in this brutal struggle. Darwin and his scientific colleagues were also troubled by another thing. They were troubled by the lack of a known physical mechanism for change. How, for example, do variations occur? How are traits passed on from one generation to the next? Now, that was the area of genetics, and Gregor Mendel actually made tremendous contributions in this area. But sadly, Darwin never heard of Mendel's work and never made that connection. Of course, now we have an understanding of the genetic code and how DNA works, and that's greatly filled in this gap of how evolution can occur. We now know that the merging of genetic material from two parents during sexual reproduction explains the origin of variation in offspring, as well as the similarities between parents and their offspring. We also know that you can have random genetic mutations that represent an additional mode of dramatic variation. Now, most mutations are going to cause grievous deformity, they're going to kill the organism and not be advantageous. But perhaps once in a very great while, a mutation can provide an extreme advantage and may lead to a whole new line of organisms, especially if that genetic trait is dominant. Well, in spite of all these controversies and misgivings, Darwin did see his own work in a larger context. He concludes The Origin of Species with the following famous words, a beautiful quote about the nature of his theory. And I want to read you this quote in full. "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone on cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." Now that we've introduced the major aspects of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, let's look at two of the hot areas of current research. Biologists accept evolution as a fact, but there remain several theories about the details of the rate of evolution and the mechanisms of evolution. First, let's look at the contention of Darwin's original thesis that change in species occurs slowly in small increments. According to this gradualist model, changes are all but invisible over the short time span of modern observations, and they are usually obscured by innumerable gaps in the imperfect fossil record. But the fossil record doesn't always conform to this idea, and every scientific theory has to be subject to modification as new data comes in. And so in 1972, American paleontologists Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge challenged conventional wisdom with an opposing viewpoint called punctuated equilibrium, which claims that species change one to another in relatively sudden bursts without a leisurely transition period. These episodes of rapid change are separated by relatively long static spans with which a species may change hardly at all, perhaps for millions of years. The punctuated equilibrium hypothesis attempts to explain a very curious and a very well-established feature of the fossil record. This is one that's been familiar to paleontologists for more than a century, but usually has been ignored because it didn't fit with the Darwinian idea. You see, many distinctive fossil species appear to remain unchanged for millions of years. That's a condition of stasis that's very much at odds with Darwin's model. Numerous distinctive marker or index fossils, for example, are abundant throughout the world's rocks. They prove useful in dating sediments because they remain unchanged for periods of time around the world. All the intermediate forms that are predicted by Darwin's gradualism seem for the most part to be lacking. In most localities you can go, you can see a given species of clam or a given series of species of coral. It persists essentially unchanged in layer after layer of rock, only to disappear, and new species of clam or coral will come in to play in higher levels of strata. One great illustration of this is North American horses, these horses were once used as a classic textbook example of the gradual evolution of a horse. But it's now providing equally compelling evidence for punctuated equilibrium. It's interesting how data can change as you look at it in new ways. There's a convincing 50 million year sequence of modern horse ancestors, each of them slightly larger, each with more complex teeth, with a longer face, with more prominent central toe and shorter side toes. These seem to prove Darwin's contention that there was gradual evolution. But if you look very closely at these fossil deposits, it reveals a somewhat different story. One that's wonderfully displayed, by the way, in a recently rearranged exhibit of horse evolution at New York's American Museum of Natural History. If you get a chance, get to that incredible museum and its fossil displays. Turns out that horses evolved in discrete steps, each of which persisted almost unchanged for millions of years and was eventually replaced by a distinctive newer model, if you will. You had the four-toed Eohippus, which preceded the three-toed Myohippus, for example, but North American fossil evidence suggests a jerky transition of distinct species between the two types. If horse evolution has been continuous, if it's been a gradual process, then one might expect that almost every fossil specimen of horse would be slightly different from every other fossil, because the fossil horse specimens are scattered across the country, and there are very few of them. There may be only several hundred fossil horse specimens total known. So the fact that you see certain distinct species and not those intermediates would lend credence to this idea of punctuated equilibrium. If it seems difficult to understand how such a major change could occur rapidly, consider this. An alteration of a single gene in fruit flies is enough to turn a normal fly with a single pair of wings into a fly that has two pairs of wings. That's a single chain and a single gene. So it certainly is possible that other changes could cause dramatic differences between two types of horses. On the other hand, remember those Russian trilobites, the ones with the long eye stalks that suggest a gradual transition? So, which is correct? Is it gradualism? Is it punctuated equilibrium? Well, most likely both ideas are correct at times and at places. And we really have to go to the evidence of the rocks to understand. Evolution is what evolution is. It isn't what we impose on it because of our theories, which may be much more narrow. One of the key ideas of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is that new species have to replace old species. The vast majority of fossil species, including dinosaurs and trilobites and ammonites, other creatures that disappeared millions of years ago, they're all extinct. By some estimates, as much as 99.9% of all the species that ever lived on Earth are now extinct. This process of extinction, how it occurs, is one of the hottest topics in evolutionary research today. If you look at the fossil record in detail, what you find is the extinction rate is not at all constant. In some formations, millions of years of sediments may contain almost a constant assemblage of organisms. But then other strata show abrupt loss of species. And the fossil record, if you look at it in detail, reveals at least 5 distinct mass extinction events. This is when a significant fraction of all the species became extinct in essentially a geological instant. The scale of the worst of these events is beyond imagining. It took place 245 million years ago at the close of the Permian. In a brief geological interval, certainly less than a million years, maybe much shorter than that, as many as 96% of all living species vanished. At least 5 major extinction episodes, perhaps a dozen more lesser ones, are also documented, and you do this by carefully looking at rock layer after rock layer and the organisms that are contained therein. This also shows us that life on Earth is very resilient, because each time there's been a mass extinction, it's come back with a vengeance with whole new varieties of organisms. The causes of mass extinctions are a matter of much debate. One clear contributing cause, I've already mentioned to you in a previous lecture, is death by large asteroid or comet impact. Worldwide evidence suggests that this happened with the demise of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. A giant asteroid, perhaps 20 miles in diameter, slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula. Huge amounts of dust and smoke from that collision, ensuing fires all over the world, would have blanketed the Earth with a thick coating of dust and debris, blocked the sunlight, would have killed off many of the plants, and caused a prolonged premature winter that many larger organisms couldn't have survived. The Great Permian extinction 245 million years ago is a different matter. There's no clear evidence for any large impact at that period. Instead, this episode seems to have spanned about 1 million years of extreme environmental stress. By the end of the Permian period, all of the Earth's major continents had merged into one supercontinent. This caused drastic changes in global climate. It caused changes in the amount of coastline there was. Global sea levels dropped probably by about 300 feet, perhaps as an increase of the volume of the ocean basin when the continents all came together. Other researchers point to the possibility of sudden poisoning of the ocean by a rapid increase in carbon dioxide, or even an overturning of the ocean in a very unusual kind of event. This is evidence from massive limestone deposits from right around that period. Added to these dramatic changes, there was a million-year period of intense volcanism in Siberia. That's an episode that may have spewed out a cubic mile of lava every year while it polluted the atmosphere and darkened the skies with various sort of volcanic exhalations. And then astronomers have come up with at least one other plausible scenario for mass extinction. That would be a supernova. Recall that any star much larger than the Sun ends its life in a supernova explosion that instantaneously unleashes frightening amounts of intense radiation for a short time period. These events aren't very common, but the universe has lots of time, and there are lots of stars within a few tens of light years of Earth. If one of these underwent a supernova explosion, our planet would have been bathed in killer radiation, and the effects on the planet's biosphere might have been severe. Now, there's no evidence that such an extinction has ever occurred, but the possibility still remains. Of all the historic extinction events, the disappearance of most large North American mammals, including mastodons and mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, about 11,000 years ago, is perhaps the most sobering of all. Fossil bones indicate that approximately 2/3 of the large mammal species in North America and in South America died out at about that time. Now, this mass extinction differs from others in 2 key respects. First of all, smaller life forms don't appear at all to have been affected by this mass extinction. The second thing is that human stone weapons are often found among the scavenged bones. So to the list of potential causes of mass extinction, we have to add human activities. According to University of Washington paleontologist Peter Ward, quote, "We are in the middle of a mass extinction as profound as any that can be recognized in the geological record." The growing evidence for a human-induced mass extinction is absolutely staggering. In Australia, which was the home of 50 species of large mammals just 50,000 years ago, there are now only 4 species of that size. Hawaii has lost more than half of its approximately 100 species of native birds, and has lost perhaps 99% of the estimated 1,000 species of land snails. Now, these are brilliantly colored snails, slow-moving, and they're avidly sought by collectors. So collectors would go to Hawaii and be the person to find the last last individual or particular species was a great coup for a collector, believe it or not, wiping out an entire species through these collecting. This has happened in the last 2 centuries. Humans have systematically hunted and exterminated the dodo, a dozen or so species of the moa, the great auk, which is another kind of bird, the passenger pigeon, of which there were once more than 5 billion individuals in North America, and many, many other species. This is going on today. Overfishing, it's drastically reduced populations of wild salmon in the Northwest, of blue crabs and oysters in the Chesapeake Bay, schools of fish in the northern oceans, which are dwindling drastically now. Ecologist Norman Myers estimates that Brazilian species now disappear at the rate of 4 per day. Biologist Paul Ehrlich fears that by the year 2000, the planet's extinction rate will be on the order of 1 species every few minutes going extinct. As the human population increases, virtually without control, wilderness areas, especially the dwindling tracts of species-rich tropical rainforests, are being gobbled up. To these immediate causes of species, you have to add the long-term effects of global warming, of ozone depletion, of atmospheric pollution, all of which lead to environmental stress, and all of which I'm going to discuss in the next lecture. In summary, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is based on 4 common-sense observations. All species produce more offspring than they possibly can survive. Individual species display variations. Third, that advantageous traits provide an individual with a better chance of survival. And finally, after many generations, gradual changes add up to large changes, and that's the process of evolution. This theory continues to receive much study and much research as scientists attempt to understand the rates of evolutionary change, as well as the causes of extinction. In the next 2 lectures, then, we're going to examine some of the implications of these human activities on the Earth's biosphere.